She is just the maid, not family. That is how my dad introduced me at my sister's engagement party. My mom agreed, adding that some people are just meant to serve. But then, the groom's mother locked eyes with me and asked if I was the chief executive officer who just bought out their $50 million property. The room went completely silent, and my dad turned pale. My name is Vivian. I am 33 years old, and I am somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As the founder of a private equity firm, I escaped their toxicity years ago, but maintained occasional distant contact. When they invited me to my younger sister's lavish engagement party, I expected the usual snide remarks and cold shoulders. I did not expect to be handed a serving tray and stripped of my identity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. To understand how that explosive moment in the living room happened, we have to go back 1 hour earlier. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago meant projecting privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling estate, emotional coldness and conditional love permeated every single corner. The heavy wooden door of the caterer's kitchen swung shut behind me, momentarily muffling the sound of the string quartet playing in the main hall. I had barely set my purse down on the marble island when a piece of stiff black fabric hit me squarely in the chest. I caught it before it dropped to the floor. It was a catering apron. I looked up to see my mother Patricia glaring at me. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into an unnatural blonde helmet, and her designer gown looked tight enough to restrict oxygen to her brain. "Put that on and wash your hands," she snapped, waving a manicured finger toward the industrial sink. Two of the serving staff called in sick, and we have over 80 guests arriving in 20 minutes. I stared at the black apron in my hands, then looked back at her. "Mom, I am a guest here. I am Sydney's sister." My mother let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "Sister or not, you showed up to the most important night of Sydney's life empty-handed." "I did not come empty-handed," I replied evenly, keeping my voice low and controlled. "I brought a crystal vase from Baccarat. I left it on the gift table in the foyer." Patricia rolled her eyes in dramatic disgust, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace. A vase. How utterly generic and cheap. "The groom's family is flying in from Boston, Vivian. Elijah's parents expect a certain caliber of lifestyle. Do you have any idea how much this engagement party is costing your father and me? The floral arrangements alone cost more than whatever pathetic salary you make in an entire year. Since you cannot contribute financially to this family's image, you can at least make yourself useful. Tie the apron around your waist. You are serving the champagne tonight." Before I could formulate a response to her sheer audacity, the kitchen doors swung open again. My younger sister Sydney marched in. At 28 years old, she was the undisputed golden child of the household. She wore a custom silk gown that probably cost a small fortune, her massive engagement ring flashing aggressively under the recessed lighting. Mom, the caterers forgot to put the truffles on the caviar blinis. Sydney whined, her voice carrying that familiar tone of entitled irritation. Then she stopped, noticing me holding the black apron. She smiled, a slow, predatory smirk that I had seen 1,000 times during our childhood. "Oh, perfect," Sydney said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are putting her to work. Honestly, Vivian, you blend right in with the help. Just keep your head down and do not talk to anyone important. Elijah's family is old money. They do not need to know I have a sister who lives in a shoebox and barely scrapes by." I looked at Sydney, taking in her smug expression. She had always been exactly like this. Vain, superficial, and entirely dependent on our parents' bank accounts. Growing up, while I was forced to take out massive student loans and work double shifts to afford my rent, Sydney was handed a brand new luxury sports car for merely passing her classes. When I decided not to attend law school as my father demanded and moved out to start my own path, my parents cut me off completely. They told all their country club friends that I was a massive disappointment, a lost cause who chose a life of struggle over their prestigious legacy. They had absolutely no idea that the lost cause standing in front of them was now the founder and chief executive officer of Pinnacle Holdings, a firm managing billions of dollars in assets for the top 1% of society. "You want me to serve drinks at your engagement party?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, as I smoothed the black fabric of the apron between my fingers. "It is the absolute least you can do," Sydney scoffed, turning to check her reflection in the dark glass of the commercial oven. "You have been a complete ghost for years. You drop out of our lives, refuse to follow Dad's career advice, and then show up looking like you bought that plain dress off a clearance rack. If you are going to be here, you need to earn your keep. Do not mess up the champagne pours. And please, try not to embarrass me in front of Elijah. He is a brilliant surgeon, and his parents are practically royalty in their social circles. I do not need them thinking my family has a deadbeat relative asking for handouts." Patricia stepped forward, snatching a heavy silver tray lined with crystal flutes from a terrified-looking caterer and shoving it aggressively toward my chest. "You heard your sister. Grab a bottle of Dom Perignon and get out there, and stay away from the main seating area. I want you circulating near the patio doors. If anyone asks who you are agency staff." The profound cruelty of the demand should have hurt. Years ago, it would have shattered me completely. I would have cried, argued, or stormed out of the house, which would have only let them win the narrative that I was emotionally unstable and jealous. But I was no longer that scared, neglected girl, desperate for their scraps of affection. I was a woman who navigated boardrooms full of aggressive corporate sharks every single day. I negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions before my morning coffee. My mother and sister, with their rented jewelry and maxed-out credit cards, were nothing but small-time bullies, playing a pathetic game of dress-up. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. A slow, calculating smile formed on my lips. I took the heavy silver tray from my mother's hands without a flinch. "Of course, Mom," I said smoothly, my tone entirely devoid of sarcasm. "I would be absolutely delighted to serve the guests tonight. I would not want to ruin Sydney's perfect illusion." Patricia looked momentarily confused by my rapid compliance, but her blinding vanity quickly overrode any suspicion she might have had. "Good. At least you finally understand your proper place in this house. Now go." I tied the black apron around my waist, securing it over my understated but incredibly expensive designer dress. I picked up the silver tray, balancing the crystal flutes with practiced ease. I knew something they did not. I knew that the grand mansion we were standing in, the one my father constantly bragged about owning, was actually drowning in defaulted mortgages. I knew the complete truth about their collapsing finances. But more importantly, I knew exactly who was on the guest list tonight. As I pushed open the swinging doors to enter the main hall, the hum of wealthy conversation washed over me. I stepped into the sea of guests, holding the champagne tray high. I was ready to play the maid. I was ready to serve them. And I was more than ready to watch their entire fabricated world burn to the ground. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the carefully curated crowd, reflecting off the polished marble floors of the grand living room. I balanced the heavy silver tray in my hands, stepping gracefully through the sea of guests. My father had spared no expense tonight, hiring a live string quartet that played softly in the corner and ordering enough expensive floral arrangements to choke a botanical garden. He was trying desperately to project the image of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. Waitstaff milled around in crisp black uniforms, offering hors d'oeuvres to local socialites and my parents' country club acquaintances. I scanned the room easily, spotting the center of attention. Standing near the massive stone fireplace was my sister Sydney. She was clinging possessively to the arm of her fiancé, her custom silk dress shimmering as she laughed a little too loudly at a joke someone had just made. Elijah was a tall, striking African-American man with a calm, commanding presence that contrasted sharply with Sydney's frantic, nervous energy. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed quiet luxury, the kind of generational wealth that did not need to flash designer logos to prove its worth. Beside him stood his parents, Winston and Josephine. They exuded the effortless grace of true elite society. Winston held his glass with relaxed confidence, listening politely to my father. Richard was gesturing wildly, his face flushed with the effort of bragging about his import business and the sprawling square footage of this very estate. He was weaving a complex web of financial exaggerations, trying to secure his position in Winston's eyes. Josephine stood beside her husband, her posture impeccable, in a stunning emerald gown, observing the room with sharp, highly intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the cheap veneer of my family's performance. I navigated through the clusters of chatting guests, keeping my expression entirely neutral. The heavy tray cut into my palms, but I ignored the slight sting. I stepped closer, positioning myself just outside their immediate circle, holding the tray of vintage champagne at the perfect, unobtrusive angle. I waited for a lull in their conversation before stepping forward to offer the drinks, playing the role of the silent staff member my mother had assigned me. As I approached the edge of their group, Richard turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a fraction of a second, raw, unadulterated panic flashed across his face. He had specifically ordered me not to attend this engagement party unless I brought a gift worthy of his extravagant, unrealistic standards. Seeing me here wearing a black catering apron over my designer dress serving drinks to his guests was a direct threat to the flawless illusion he was desperately trying to sell to Winston and Josephine. His panic rapidly morphed into a dark, simmering rage. Before I could even extend the tray toward the guests, Richard lunged forward. He snatched a crystal flute from the silver surface with such sudden force that the remaining glasses clinked dangerously against each other, nearly toppling over. His face flushed a deep, angry red, the veins in his neck standing out against his tight collar. Elijah, noticing the sudden, aggressive movement and the harsh clinking of glass, turned his full attention to me. He looked at my face, offering a polite, warm smile, the kind of respectful greeting you give to a new acquaintance. He studied my features for a moment, clearly noticing a slight familial resemblance between Sydney and me. "Is this your older sister, Vivian?" Elijah asked gently, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of the party. "You mentioned she might be dropping by tonight to celebrate." The air in our small circle seemed to evaporate instantly. The string quartet in the background felt miles away. Richard stepped directly into my line of sight, using his body to physically block me from Elijah and his parents. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded entirely unnatural and bordered on hysterical. "Oh, do not be ridiculous!" Elijah, my father, boomed, making sure his voice carried loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear every single word. "Do not pay any attention to her. She is just the maid, not family." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My mother Patricia materialized beside him in an instant, moving with the speed of a predator protecting its territory. She placed a possessive manicured hand on Josephine's arm, her diamond rings catching the chandelier light. "Exactly?" Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with sweet, venomous condescension. "We hired extra help for the evening because Sydney deserves only the absolute best for her special night. You know how it is, Josephine. Some people are simply born to be successful and others are just meant to serve. We prefer to keep our bloodline associated with the former. We certainly do not claim the help as our own." I shifted my gaze to my sister. Sydney was leaning her head against Elijah's shoulder, acting the part of the delicate, pampered bride-to-be. She looked right at me, her lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smirk. She was loving every single second of this public humiliation. She tightened her grip on her fiancé's arm, silently declaring her victory. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she had successfully reduced me to nothing more than a pathetic servant in front of the wealthy family she was marrying, into erasing my existence to elevate her own status. I did not flinch. I did not drop the tray. I did not shed a single tear. Years ago, a public rejection like this from my own flesh and blood would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. I would have run out of the room crying, proving their point that I was weak, unstable, and a massive disappointment. But tonight, standing in that opulent living room, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating clarity. I looked at Richard's sweating forehead and his desperate fake bravado. I looked at Patricia's cruel plastic smile. I looked at Sydney's pathetic need for external validation. They were not a family. They were a failing enterprise built on a mountain of toxic debt lies and fragile egos. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask of professional courtesy. I held the silver tray steady, playing the role they had forced upon me without uttering a single word of protest. My silence was not submission, it was a strategic assessment. I knew that in the ruthless world of business, just as in life, you never interrupt your opponent when they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake. You stand back and let them dig their own grave. And my father had just handed himself a shovel. I kept my eyes locked on the group, my gaze cold and unwavering, waiting for the exact moment the entire charade would implode. Josephine had just raised the crystal flute toward her lips when she suddenly froze. Her perfectly manicured hand halted in midair. She did not take a sip. Instead, she lowered the glass slowly, her sharp gaze cutting past my father's imposing figure and locking entirely onto my face. The polite, detached smile she had worn all evening vanished, replaced by a look of intense, focused recognition. She adjusted her posture, standing even taller, and narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to place a highly valuable painting in a museum. The string quartet continued playing an upbeat melody, but in our small circle, the temperature seemed to plummet. My father noticed the shift in her attention. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim the spotlight, opening his mouth to launch into another fabricated story about his import business. But Josephine completely ignored him. She did not even offer him the courtesy of a glance. With the effortless authority of a woman who commanded boardrooms and philanthropic galas, she stepped forward physically, brushing past my father's shoulder. Richard stumbled back a half step, his mouth snapping shut in sheer confusion. Patricia let out a soft gasp, clearly scandalized that someone would brush past her husband, but too intimidated by Josephine's elite status to say a single word. Josephine stopped less than 2 feet away from me. She ignored the tray of champagne entirely. She looked directly into my eyes, her expression shifting from recognition to absolute astonishment. "Wait a moment," Josephine commanded, her voice ringing out with a sharp, undeniable authority that sliced through the ambient chatter of the surrounding guests. The conversations nearest to us began to die down. People turned their heads, sensing the sudden shift in gravity. "Are you Vivian?" Josephine asked, her tone carrying a mixture of shock and deep respect. "Ms. Vivian, the Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Holdings. The brilliant woman who just closed the $50 million commercial real estate acquisition with my family last month in the Hamptons. If a bomb had detonated in the center of the living room, the devastation could not have been more absolute." The sheer volume and clarity of Josephine's words acted as an immediate silencer. The nearby guests stopped talking entirely. The silence spread outward like a shockwave until even the string quartet faltered, the musicians lowering their bows as the heavy, suffocating quiet consumed the entire grand hall. I kept my posture perfectly straight, balancing the silver tray without a single tremor in my hands. I met Josephine's gaze and offered a calm, professional nod. The blood drained from my father's face so rapidly, I thought he might actually collapse onto the imported rug. Richard stood frozen, his eyes bulging, his jaw working uselessly as his brain short-circuited, trying to process the catastrophic collision of his two worlds. The daughter he had just publicly degraded as a lowly servant was suddenly being addressed as a high-powered executive by the very billionaire he was desperately trying to impress. The veins in his neck throbbed, but no sound came out. Beside him, Patricia looked as if she had been physically struck. Her heavily sprayed blonde hair seemed to lose its bounce. She gripped the edge of a nearby console table, her knuckles turning white, her mouth forming a silent, horrified oval. The fake, syrupy smile she had worn all night melted away, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked wildly from Josephine to me, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. But there was none. Then there was Sydney. My golden sister, who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, looked like she had just swallowed broken glass. Her smug, triumphant smirk vanished instantly. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped from Elijah's arm. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate denial. She shook her head slightly, muttering the word no under her breath over and over again. The $50 million figure hung in the air, a massive, crushing weight that instantly pulverized Sydney's pathetic sense of superiority. Elijah, however, reacted completely differently. He did not look panicked or confused. He turned his head slowly, looking at the black catering apron tied around my waist, then up to my face. The polite, distant smile he had offered earlier transformed into a look of profound, calculated respect. He was a smart man, an elite surgeon who understood the brutal dynamics of power and wealth. He saw the apron, he heard his mother's declaration, and he instantly put the pieces together. He realized right then and there that he had walked into a house built on lies, and the only person holding any real power was the woman holding the serving tray. I did not break eye contact with Josephine. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, forcing my family to drown in their own public humiliation. Every single guest in the immediate vicinity was now staring at Richard and Patricia, their whispers starting to hiss through the room like venomous snakes. "Yes, Mrs. Josephine," I replied, my voice steady, carrying the exact professional cadence I used when destroying corporate rivals in the boardroom. "It is a pleasure to see you again. I apologize for the informal attire. My family has a rather unique and demanding way of welcoming me back home. They insisted I earn my keep this evening, since my gifts apparently do not meet their financial standards." Josephine's eyes narrowed dangerously. She turned her head slowly, directing a look of pure, concentrated disgust at my father. Richard actually shrank back under her gaze, his broad shoulders curling inward as the last remnants of his fake patriarch persona disintegrated into dust. The guests surrounding us were no longer just casually observing. They were actively witnessing the social execution of Richard and Patricia. In elite circles, wealth was respected, but authenticity and class were paramount. To treat a highly successful chief executive officer, let alone one's own flesh and blood, as a disposable servant was not just cruel. It was a massive social liability. It exposed my parents as classless, desperate frauds who valued cruel hierarchy over actual achievement. I watched the realization hit my mother. Patricia was a woman who lived and died by country club gossip. She could see the judgmental stares of her so-called friends burning into her back. She knew with terrifying certainty that by tomorrow morning, this story would be the only thing anyone in their zip code would be talking about. The narrative of their perfect wealthy family was dead, publicly slaughtered by the mother of the groom. Elijah took a deliberate step away from Sydney. It was a small movement, just a few inches, but the physical distance spoke volumes. He looked at my sister, his eyes scanning her panicked face, assessing the toxic reality of the family he was about to marry into. Sydney reached out, her fingers trembling, trying to grab his sleeve again, but he smoothly shifted his weight, avoiding her touch entirely. This was the payoff. This was the exact moment the tables completely turned. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had simply stood my ground, held a tray of champagne, and let the undeniable weight of my own success crush their pathetic illusions. My father, the man who had kicked me out and called me a failure, was now trembling before the billionaire client I had personally conquered. The suffocating silence stretched until it became physically unbearable for my father. Richard was a man who survived purely on bluster, intimidation, and the blind obedience of those around him. But faced with Josephine's undeniable authority and her public recognition of my actual status, his entire foundation crumbled. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the harsh light of the chandelier. He let out a booming, entirely hollow laugh that grated against the quiet room, sounding more like a barking dog than a wealthy patriarch. "Oh, Josephine Winston, please," Richard bellowed. He spread his arms wide in a desperate sweeping gesture of forced joviality. "You must forgive us. It is just a silly family joke, a little running gag we have between us. Vivian here has always had such a unique sense of humor. We love to play these little practical jokes on each other." She actually insisted on putting on the apron to surprise the guests. You know how these independent millennials are always trying to make some sort of ironic statement against wealth. He was talking far too fast, the words spilling out of his mouth in a frantic, sweaty rush to rewrite reality. He looked wildly around the immediate circle of guests, his eyes darting from face to face, practically begging them to buy into his pathetic narrative. He wanted them to believe that degrading his own daughter in front of the groom's parents was merely an eccentric quirk of the ultra-wealthy. He looked at Winston hoping to find some sort of patriarchal solidarity, but Winston merely raised an eyebrow, his expression a mask of aristocratic disdain. Patricia, sensing that her husband's clumsy gaslighting was failing miserably, swooped in to assist. She was a master of maintaining appearances, a woman who would rather burn her own house down than admit a flaw to her country club friends. She glided to my side, her expensive emerald gown brushing against my cheap catering apron. To the untrained eye, she looked exactly like an affectionate mother stepping close to her beloved daughter to share a laugh. But I knew the monster hiding behind that expensive Botox and practiced smile. Patricia slid her hand around my arm. Her grip was ironclad. She dug her sharp acrylic nails directly into my skin, twisting the flesh just above my elbow with practiced quiet cruelty. The pain was sharp and immediate. It was a physical warning, a tactic she had used since I was a teenager, designed to force my immediate compliance in public settings. "Vivian, darling." Patricia cooed, her voice sugary sweet for the audience standing just inches away. But as she leaned her head closer to mine, supposedly to share an intimate mother-daughter moment, her tone dropped into a venomous, guttural hiss audible only to me. "Play along right now. You tell them this is a joke. You smile, you agree with your father, or I swear I will make you regret walking through that front door. Do not you dare humiliate us in front of these people. Fix this mess immediately." She increased the pressure of her nails, expecting me to cower. She expected the compliant, terrified girl who used to shrink away from her wrath, the girl who would swallow her own pride just to keep the peace in a toxic household. I looked down at the manicured hand clutching my arm. Then I looked back up, meeting my mother's furious, desperate eyes. I did not wince from the pain. I did not break my professional composure. Instead, with a slow, deliberate motion that drew the attention of every single person watching, I shifted my weight and forcefully yanked my arm out of her grip. The movement was crisp, violent, and undeniable. Patricia stumbled forward half a step, completely caught off guard by my physical resistance. She let out a small, undignified gasp as her hand swatted empty air, her heavy diamond bracelet clanking noisily against her wrist. I smoothed the fabric of my sleeve, where her nails had just been, making sure the gesture of rejection was highly visible to Josephine, Winston, and Elijah. I turned my body slightly, positioning myself, not as a subservient daughter awaiting a reprimand, but as the chief executive officer of Pinnacle Holdings facing a hostile negotiation. I held the silver tray of champagne with one hand, a casual display of effortless strength, and looked directly into Josephine's sharp, intelligent eyes. "There is no joke," I stated clearly. My voice was neither loud nor angry. It was the precise, resonant, and unapologetic tone I used to close nine-figure deals and terminate underperforming executives. The sound of it sliced through Richard's fabricated narrative like a surgical scalpel. I held Josephine's gaze, establishing a mutual understanding between two women who knew exactly how to command a room and spot a fraud. "My family has a very special way of treating a daughter who does not follow their precise wishes, Mrs. Josephine. When I refused to bend to my father's career demands years ago, they cut me off completely. They threw me out. Tonight my presence was only tolerated if I agreed to serve their guests as free labor." This apron is not an ironic statement. It is a punishment. A punishment for showing up to my sister's engagement party without a gift expensive enough to satisfy their endless consuming vanity. The words landed like physical blows. The collective gasp from the surrounding guests was audible, a sharp intake of breath that echoed across the vaulted ceiling. Richard's face transformed from a flushed, angry red to an ashen, sickly gray. He staggered backward slightly as if I had shoved him. Sydney, standing a few feet away, let out a choked sob of pure mortification. She looked up at Elijah, desperately hoping he would defend her, but Elijah was staring at my parents with a look of profound, quiet disgust. The carefully constructed facade of the loving, prosperous upper-crust family was officially torn apart. I had ripped down the velvet curtains to reveal the rotting framework underneath. There was no more gaslighting. There were no more polite excuses. I had left nothing but the ugly, toxic truth exposed under the bright crystal lights, and they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Josephine's eyes did not widen with pity or scandal. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across her elegant features. It was a smile of absolute, unfiltered respect. She recognized a fellow apex predator, a woman who had forged her own empire from the ashes of rejection. Josephine nodded slowly, her emerald earrings catching the harsh light, completely ignoring the frantic, hyperventilating gasps of my mother standing nearby. That single nod of approval from the billionaire matriarch was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Sydney could not handle it. For 28 years, my younger sister had been the center of the universe, the flawless golden child who thrived on my subjugation. Seeing the woman she desperately wanted to impress look at me with sheer admiration broke whatever fragile restraint Sydney had left. The delicate, blushing bride persona vanished instantly, replaced by the ugly, bitter reality of a spoiled child throwing a vicious tantrum. "She is lying!" Sydney shrieked. Her voice cracked wildly as she stomped forward, her custom silk gown tangling around her ankles. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Do not believe a single word she says, Josephine. She is a complete fraud. Dad kicked her out because she was a massive failure." The string quartet had completely stopped playing by now. The room was so incredibly quiet you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses of the paralyzed guests. "She is a college dropout." Sydney continued, her pitch rising hysterically, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to drag me back down into the mud. "She walked out of this house with absolutely nothing. No degree, no trust fund, not a single penny to her name. She lived in a disgusting studio apartment and worked minimum wage jobs. Whatever this Pinnacle Holdings is, it has to be a scam. It is probably a front for dirty money. There is no physical way a broke, uneducated failure like her built a multi-million-dollar firm legally. She is trying to con you." Sydney panted, her face flushed red, looking at Elijah and his parents with wild, expectant eyes. She genuinely believed she had just delivered the winning blow. She thought exposing my past poverty and lack of a traditional Ivy League degree would horrify this old money family. She expected them to recoil from me in disgust, to call security to validate her lifelong belief that I was nothing but trash. Instead, Winston stepped forward. Elijah's father was an imposing figure, a man who commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. He had spent the entire evening quietly observing my father's pathetic bragging, his face a mask of polite indifference. But now that indifference was gone, his dark eyes locked onto Sydney with a chilling, surgical precision. Winston did not look disgusted by me. He looked utterly repulsed by my sister. "Dirty money," Winston repeated. His deep, resonant voice cut through the tense air like a heavy blade. He slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket, his gaze shifting from Sydney to Richard. "That is a fascinating accusation, young lady. Especially considering my legal team, a firm that charges $2,000 an hour, spent 3 consecutive months conducting rigorous due diligence on Pinnacle Holdings before finalizing our recent acquisition. They audited every single financial record, every offshore account, and every corporate filing. I can assure you, Ms. Vivian's capital is not only flawlessly legitimate, but her investment strategies are brilliant enough to outmaneuver Wall Street veterans twice her age. Sydney's mouth opened and closed silently, her desperate accusation instantly neutralized by a man whose financial authority was unquestionable. The guests murmured, the elite crowd immediately recognizing the absolute foolishness of challenging a billionaire's legal team. Winston took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance between himself and my father. Richard instinctively shrank back, his broad shoulders caving inward, his bravado entirely shattered. But what I find truly fascinating, Richard Winston continued, his tone dangerously soft, is the boast your daughter just made on your behalf. She seems quite proud of the fact that you threw your own child out onto the street without a single penny. Richard opened his mouth, raising his hands in a weak, defensive gesture. Winston, please, you must understand the context. It was tough love. She was rebellious. We were trying to teach her a lesson about the real world so she would come back and follow the right path. Do not insult my intelligence, Richard Winston snapped. His voice finally cracked like a whip, echoing off the marble walls. I built my entire fortune from the dirt up. As a black man in this country, I grew up in neighborhoods where survival was a daily, brutal struggle. I know exactly what the real world looks like, and I know exactly what it takes to climb out of it. It takes grit, it takes relentless sacrifice, and it takes an iron will. Your daughter Vivian has all of those things. But you claim to be a man of family values, yet you brag about discarding your own flesh and blood because she did not fit into your shallow, pathetic mold. Winston turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the silent, staring guests, before landing back on my father. To abandon a child to the streets is not tough love. It is cowardice. And to then invite her back into your home merely to force her to serve your guests in an apron to humiliate her out of sheer spite, that is not the behavior of a patriarch. That is the behavior of a weak, insecure tyrant who is terrified of a woman stronger than he is. The absolute brutality of Winston's assessment left no room for argument. My father looked physically ill, his hands shaking violently at his sides. He had spent his entire life trying to buy his way into rooms with men like Winston, only to be publicly dissected and discarded by one in front of his entire social circle. Patricia covered her mouth with her hand, suppressing a sob of pure mortification as she realized their social standing in this city was officially dead. Sydney burst into sudden theatrical tears, trying to salvage the situation by playing the victim. She reached out for Elijah, her hands trembling, her diamond ring flashing uselessly. "Elijah, please," she sobbed, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "They are twisting everything. She ruined our night. She did this on purpose to destroy us. You have to believe me." But Elijah did not reach back. The elite surgeon, the man who had treated Sydney like a princess since the day they met, took a very deliberate step backward. He looked at her not with love, but with the cold, analytical detachment of a doctor assessing a terminal disease. The mask had slipped, and he finally saw the vicious, entitled core of the woman he was supposed to marry. I remained perfectly still, the silver tray resting lightly in my hands. I did not need to say a single word to defend myself against Sydney's accusations. The very people she had tried to impress had just become my most lethal advocates. My family had handed me the executioner's axe, but Winston had graciously offered to swing it for me. The silence in the room was no longer just awkward, it was the sound of a carefully constructed empire of lies crashing violently to the marble floor. The heavy, oppressive silence following Winston's absolute dismantling of my father hung over the grand living room like a physical weight. The elite guests, people who spent their entire lives perfecting the art of polite ignorance, were now staring openly, completely captivated by the grotesque spectacle of Richard's unraveling. My father was a man who measured his entire worth by the intimidation he could project. Stripped of his authority, publicly dressed down by a billionaire he had spent months trying to court, he looked like a cornered animal. His face transitioned from a sickly gray back to a volatile, mottled purple. He could not accept defeat. Narcissists never do. When their reality is challenged, they double down, retreating to the only weapon they understand, which is material possession. Richard violently adjusted the collar of his expensive tuxedo, sucking in his gut, and throwing his shoulders back in a pathetic attempt to physically dominate the space. He forced a harsh, booming laugh that carried no humor, only sheer desperation. He looked at Winston, refusing to acknowledge the profound disgust radiating from the older man, and decided that the only way to save face was to prove his financial superiority. "You are completely mistaken, Winston!" My father bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He swept his thick arm in a wide, erratic arc, gesturing to the opulent surroundings. "You are letting a few lucky deals cloud your judgment about who you are actually dealing with here. Vivian is a fluke, a complete and utter anomaly. She rode a brief volatile market trend, playing with paper money, and now she thinks she can stand in the same room as real titans of industry. But she knows absolutely nothing about building a lasting legacy." Patricia, still gripping the edge of the console table, nodded vigorously. She plastered a strained, terrifying smile onto her face, trying to project the image of a supportive wife even as the country club guests continued to whisper behind their hands. "Look around you," Richard demanded, his volume rising as he paced a few steps across the imported Persian rug. "Look at what I have built with my own two hands." "You talk about survival." "Winston, I built an import and export empire that spans 3 continents. I move thousands of shipping containers every single month. I employ hundreds of people. And this estate?" He stamped his expensive leather shoe hard against the polished marble floor. "I own this property, 2 acres in the most exclusive, impenetrable zip code in the state. I paid for the custom Italian marble beneath our feet. I paid for the crystal chandeliers above our heads. This is real, tangible, generational wealth. Not some digital hedge fund scam managed by a college dropout who got lucky in a tech bubble." He was practically shouting now, completely oblivious to the cardinal rule of high society. "Old money never ever screams about price tags." Winston and Josephine watched him with a level of revulsion usually reserved for stepping in something foul on the sidewalk. Bragging about imported marble and shipping containers while simultaneously degrading his own daughter only cemented his status as a classless, desperate fraud. Elijah stood rigidly beside his parents. He looked at the massive stone fireplace, the cascading floral arrangements, and then back at my father. The handsome surgeon's jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He was a man who dedicated his life to saving people, a man raised with impeccable morals and quiet dignity. Watching his future father-in-law foam at the mouth, desperately trying to quantify his worth through real estate while viciously tearing down his own child, was the final nail in the coffin. Elijah looked thoroughly physically sickened. Sydney, sensing that her father's bragging was not having the desired effect on her fiancé, tried to chime in. Her voice was shrill and panicky. "My dad is right, Elijah. We have a real legacy. Vivian is just a vulture. She just swoops in and takes advantage of other people's hard work. She is not like us. We are builders. We have real assets." I watched the entire pathetic performance without a single fluctuation in my heart rate. I did not raise my voice to defend my business acumen. I did not scream about the sleepless nights, the ruthless negotiations, or the brilliant financial modeling that had built Pinnacle Holdings into an industry titan. I simply stood there, wearing the black catering apron over my designer dress, letting them dig their financial grave with every boastful word. They were so incredibly arrogant. They were so blinded by their own desperate need to appear wealthy that they had completely forgotten the golden rule of business. You never brag about assets unless you actually own them. I slowly lowered the heavy silver tray of vintage champagne, placing it gently onto the pristine surface of a nearby marble console table. The soft clink of the crystal flute settling against the silver drew the eyes of several guests. I smoothed the front of the black apron, ensuring my movements were graceful, deliberate, and entirely unbothered. I reached into the hidden side pocket of my dress and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim, warm light of the living room. I ignored the screaming, red-faced man who contributed half my genetics and opened a secure messaging application. My legal assistant, an absolute shark of a lawyer named Harrison, had been sitting in a sleek black SUV at the end of the estate's sprawling driveway for the past 45 minutes. I had instructed him to wait for my signal. I had wanted to give my family one last chance to behave with a shred of decency before I unleashed the consequences of their actions. But Richard's decision to use this specific house as his shield of honor was the green light I needed. I typed a single precise sentence. "Bring the red folder inside right now. We are ready." I hit send. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and clasped my hands loosely in front of me, returning my gaze to my father. He was still ranting, his chest heaving, listing off the imaginary millions he claimed to have locked away in offshore accounts. I allowed a tiny, chilling smile to play at the corners of my mouth. He had absolutely no idea that the ground he was so proudly stamping his expensive shoes on had stopped belonging to him months ago. I stepped away from the marble console table, leaving the heavy silver tray of champagne behind. I did not need to play the servant anymore. I clasped my hands loosely in front of me, adopting the exact posture I used when leading a hostile takeover in a corporate boardroom. I looked at my father, letting a beat of absolute silence pass between us. The guests in the grand living room were holding their breath, their eyes darting back and forth like spectators at a blood sport. "You speak so passionately about your import and export empire, Dad." I began, my voice perfectly level and conversational. "You mentioned moving thousands of shipping containers every single month across 3 continents. That is quite an impressive logistical feat, especially considering the current maritime freight rates." Richard puffed out his chest again, though his eyes remained wary. "It takes a brilliant mind to navigate the global supply chain, Vivian. Something you would not understand playing with imaginary numbers on a computer screen. Real business requires tangible assets." "Tangible assets," I repeated, nodding slowly, as if deeply considering his profound wisdom. "Like the inventory currently sitting in the port of Los Angeles, I read a fascinating industry report recently. It seems a certain Midwestern import company had 42 shipping containers seized by maritime authorities last Tuesday." The color drained from my father's face so rapidly, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. "A minor customs dispute," Richard stammered, his booming voice suddenly losing a significant amount of its volume. "Bureaucratic red tape. It happens to every major player in the industry. It will be resolved by Monday." A minor customs dispute. I echoed, my tone sharpening into a surgical blade. "Or a complete halt of operations because your primary commercial creditor put a hard freeze on your operating accounts. Tell me, Dad, how is your relationship with First National Security Bank these days?" Patricia let out a sharp gasp, stepping forward as if she could physically shield her husband from my words. "How dare you speak about private family business in front of our guests?" she hissed, her eyes wide with panic. "You are making things up to embarrass us." I completely ignored my mother, keeping my gaze locked on Richard. The sweat was no longer just a single bead. It was a visible sheen across his forehead. He reached up with a trembling hand to loosen his silk tie. "Let us talk about those tangible assets you are so proud of." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "The $15 million commercial loan you took out 3 years ago was backed by the very inventory that is currently frozen on those docks. You know how it is in the logistics sector, Winston." I turned my head slightly to address Elijah's father, speaking to him peer to peer. "When a company's debt-to-equity ratio crosses a critical threshold, the banks stop smiling and start demanding immediate liquidation." Winston offered a slow, knowing nod. "Indeed they do, Ms. Vivian. Leverage is a double-edged sword for those who do not know how to swing it." Richard was hyperventilating now. He tried to force another laugh, but it sounded like a dry cough. "We are simply restructuring our assets," he sputtered, looking desperately at Elijah and Winston, praying the corporate buzzwords would act as a shield. "We are leveraging our equity for maximum tax efficiency. It is a highly complex financial strategy. You would not understand the nuances." "Restructuring," I said, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. That is a very polite, elegant word for defaulting. Tell me, how exactly do you leverage equity on an import business when your third quarter earnings report showed a negative cash flow of $4.2 million? The entire room went dead silent. The specific devastating number hung in the air, a lethal strike to the heart of my father's fake empire. Elijah, who had been watching the exchange with the quiet intensity of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness, shifted his posture. He was a man of science, logic, and precision. He looked at Sydney, who was standing completely frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her expensive silk gown. She was entirely unable to defend her father's business acumen. She had spent her whole life swiping his credit cards without ever questioning where the money came from. Elijah saw the absolute terror in her eyes. He connected the dots instantly. The generational wealth he had been promised the elite successful family he thought he was marrying into was nothing but a hollow, decaying facade. Sydney tried to grab Elijah's arm again, her voice pleading and desperate. "Elijah, baby, she is making this all up. She is just a jealous, vindictive liar. Look at her. She is just trying to ruin my perfect night because she has nothing of her own." Elijah did not look at me. He looked down at Sydney, and the warmth that had previously existed in his dark eyes was completely gone, replaced by a chilling, analytical detachment. "Is she making it up, Richard?" Elijah asked, his deep voice carrying a demanding, unyielding authority. "Because those are highly specific financial figures for a jealous sister to simply invent out of thin air." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Elijah, then at Winston, and finally at the surrounding guests who were watching his public execution with morbid fascination. He could not form a single coherent sentence. The mighty patriarch had been reduced to a stammering, sweating mess in his own living room. "What about the payroll?" I pressed, refusing to give him a single second to breathe. "I heard the warehouse workers in your New Jersey distribution center were notified last Thursday that their health benefits are being suspended pending a corporate review. Is stripping hardworking people of their medical coverage part of your brilliant generational wealth-building strategy?" "You have no idea what you are talking about," Richard finally choked out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are getting your information from disgruntled ex-employees. You are trying to destroy my reputation with gossip." "No disgruntled employees, Dad," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Just standard public financial disclosures, distressed debt portfolios, and industry whispers. When you default on 2 consecutive quarters of a mezzanine loan, people talk. The financial sharks start circling in the water, smelling the blood of a dying company." I took one final step closer to him, lowering my voice, so only our immediate circle could hear the absolute contempt in my tone. "You brag about the imported marble under our feet and the crystal chandeliers above our heads. You demand respect and obedience from everyone around you. But true wealth is quiet. True wealth does not need to scream at a catering staff or demean a daughter to prove it exists. You are drowning in high-interest debt. Your entire import empire is a hollow shell propped up by maxed-out credit lines, fraudulent revenue projections, and sheer pathetic arrogance." Just as Richard's face twisted into a mask of pure rage, just as he opened his mouth to scream a final desperate denial at the top of his lungs, the heavy brass knocker on the grand mahogany front door echoed loudly through the silent foyer. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile, and that would be the final nail in the coffin. The echo of the heavy brass knocker shattered the paralyzing silence in the grand foyer. Every head turned toward the towering mahogany doors. A hired waiter, looking thoroughly bewildered by the intense family drama unfolding, hurried over to pull the heavy door open. Standing on the threshold was Harrison. My legal assistant was an absolute shark in a tailored midnight blue suit, exuding the kind of ruthless corporate energy that made Wall Street executives sweat. He stepped into the opulent entryway, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the imported Italian marble my father had just spent the last 20 minutes bragging about. The elite country club guests instinctively parted ways for him. Harrison did not offer a polite smile or apologize for the interruption. He walked with total unyielding purpose directly toward our tense circle. In his right hand, he carried a thick manila folder secured tightly with a prominent bright red legal seal. It was the universal symbol of highly classified, completely undeniable financial documentation. Richard stared at Harrison, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He tried to puff out his chest again, attempting to summon the last pathetic shreds of his patriarchal authority. "Who the hell are you?" Richard barked, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. "This is a private invitation, only engagement party. Security, get this man out of my house immediately." Harrison did not even blink. He completely ignored the screaming man and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. With a crisp, respectful nod, he extended the heavy envelope. "The verified asset portfolios you requested, Ms. Vivian Harrison," said his voice smooth and professional, completely unbothered by my father's frantic shouting, "directly from the county clerk and the primary lien holders." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. I took the envelope from his hands. The weight of it was incredibly satisfying. It was the physical manifestation of my father's impending ruin. I did not rush. I untied the black catering apron from my waist, letting it fall carelessly to the floor in a heap of dark fabric. I stepped out from the invisible boundary they had forced me into and walked slowly, deliberately toward the massive, ornate marble coffee table, positioned right in the center of their gathering space. Every single eye in the living room tracked my movement. Josephine and Winston watched me with quiet fascination, recognizing the precise, lethal posture of a predator moving in for the kill. Elijah stood perfectly rigid, his analytical mind already preparing for the devastating truth I was about to unleash. Sydney let out a high-pitched, panicky sound, desperately tugging at her mother's arm. Patricia looked like she was going to faint, her eyes glued in pure terror to the red seal on the envelope. I stood beside the coffee table holding the folder up so the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers caught the bold red stamp. Then, with a swift, aggressive motion, I slammed the thick folder down onto the hard marble surface. The loud, sharp smack echoed violently through the massive room, making several guests physically jump. "Dad, you boast so passionately about this magnificent estate," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure icy command. I locked eyes with him, watching the sheer panic vibrate through his body. "You stand here and you brag to Mr. Winston about the custom Italian marble under our feet and the acreage in the most exclusive zip code in the state. You demand respect because you claim to be a titan of tangible assets." I paused, letting the crushing weight of anticipation suffocate him entirely. Then I delivered the fatal blow. "But did you somehow forget to mention to Mr. Winston that this very property was formally foreclosed by the bank exactly 8 months ago?" The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was deafening. Whispers erupted immediately, tearing through the room like a sudden wildfire. For high society, bankruptcy was a tragedy, but lying about it while hosting a lavish party was the ultimate unforgivable sin. It was absolute social suicide. Richard lost his mind completely. The remaining veneer of his civilized, wealthy patriarch persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He lunged forward, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a trembling, sweaty finger directly at my face, screaming at the top of his lungs. "You vindictive, lying witch!" Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips. His voice tore through the elegant room, violent and out of control. "How dare you come into my home and spew these pathetic, jealous lies? You are making this up because you are a miserable, bitter failure. You have always been jealous of your sister. You fabricated those documents to ruin the happiest night of her life." He swiped his hand aggressively through the air, completely unhinged, addressing the stunned crowd of guests. "Do not listen to a single word she says, Winston. She is unstable. She has always been mentally unwell. She forged those papers to extort us." I own this house outright. It is completely paid for. She is committing slander. I will have her arrested for criminal defamation. Patricia practically threw herself between me and the guests, waving her arms frantically. Security, she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. Somebody call the police right now. She is trespassing. She is trying to destroy our family out of pure spite. But no security came. The hired staff were frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at the chaotic implosion of their employers. Elijah took another definitive step away from the screaming, thrashing spectacle of his future in-laws. The brilliant surgeon looked at the red-stamped folder resting on the marble table, then looked at the red-faced, screaming man, claiming it was all a jealous fabrication. Elijah did not need a background in corporate finance to spot a desperate, cornered liar. The manic desperation radiating from Richard was all the proof anyone needed. Winston and Josephine simply stared at my father, their expressions hardening into absolute disgust. They were witnessing a man trying to outrun the truth by screaming louder than the facts, and in their world, that was the ultimate mark of a spectacular failure. I simply stood my ground, my arms crossed, watching the fire burn. I let his frantic screaming echo off the vaulted ceilings until his voice completely gave out. He stood there, panting, his face a terrifying shade of purple, looking wildly at the silent crowd for a single sympathetic face. He found absolutely none. The difference between a cornered animal and a corporate executive is that one relies on blind panic while the other relies on legally binding documentation. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I simply reached forward and flipped open the heavy manila folder resting on the marble coffee table. The crisp sound of thick legal parchment shifting in the dead silent room was louder than any of his desperate shouting. I pulled out the top document, a heavily watermarked certificate bearing the official seal of the state and the county clerk office. "You call me a liar, Dad?" I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure clinical detachment. But numbers do not possess the capacity to lie. They do not care about your ego, your country club memberships, or your desperate need to impress billionaires. 8 months ago, your primary lender finalized the foreclosure on this exact property. You defaulted on your massive mortgage, and the bank seized this 2-acre estate. Patricia let out a strangled whimper, covering her mouth with both hands, as if she could physically hold back the truth from escaping into the room. Sydney was trembling so violently that her custom silk gown rustled audibly. "The bank then bundled your defaulted mortgage into a massive distressed debt portfolio," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my father. "They auctioned that portfolio off to private equity firms. And as I mentioned earlier, Pinnacle Holdings is not just a digital scam. We are an aggressive acquisition firm. We specialize in buying up the toxic, bleeding assets of failed businessmen. My firm purchased that specific portfolio. We bought the debt. We bought the deed." I slid the watermarked document across the smooth marble surface, pushing it directly toward Winston and Elijah so they could see the bold print for themselves. "Therefore," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision, "I am the sole legal owner of this property. You do not own the Italian marble under your feet. You do not own the crystal chandeliers above your heads. You do not own the dirt this mansion was built upon. I own it all. You, Patricia, and Sydney are nothing more than my tenants." The word tenants struck my family like a physical blow. In the hyper-elite circles of high society, renting was considered a temporary stepping stone, but renting the very home you publicly claimed to own was the ultimate mark of a spectacular fraud. To be exposed as tenants of the daughter they had just degraded as a maid was a level of humiliation so profound it practically suffocated them. Richard shook his head furiously, his eyes darting frantically. "No, that is a manipulation. We have an arrangement. We have a temporary leaseback program while we restructure. It is a standard corporate maneuver. We pay a premium to maintain our residency." "A premium," I echoed, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to finally break across my face. "That brings me to the most fascinating part of this entire arrangement. Because if you are going to pretend to be a wealthy patriarch paying a premium lease, you should probably actually pay your rent." I reached back into the red stamped folder and pulled out a second stack of papers, these ones stapled together and highlighted with bright yellow tabs. The monthly lease agreement for a property of this magnitude is $35,000, I informed the room, my voice carrying effortlessly to the back rows of the stunned guests. A rather steep price for a man whose commercial accounts have been frozen. You see, Winston, my tenants have not paid a single dime of their rent in exactly 3 months. They are currently $105,000 in arrears. Richard opened his mouth to scream another denial, but I slammed the stapled papers down on top of the deed before he could utter a single syllable. Do not even try to deny it, Dad, I warned him, my tone shifting from conversational to an absolute command. Because sitting right here is the formal hardship extension request submitted to my firm's property management division just 2 weeks ago. I picked up the top page and began to read aloud, making sure my voice projected clearly to every corner of the grand living room. To the managing directors of Pinnacle Holdings Property Division, I am writing to formally request a 90-day emergency extension on my outstanding lease payments. My import business is currently experiencing severe liquidity issues due to unforeseen maritime seizures. We are facing imminent insolvency if we are forced to vacate the premises. We beg you to grant us this extension so we can maintain our residence and preserve our family's public standing during my youngest daughter's upcoming engagement proceedings. Please do not force us onto the street. I stopped reading and let the pathetic begging words hang in the air. The absolute desperation of the letter stood in violent contrast to the arrogant, boastful man who had been strutting around the room just 30 minutes ago. I lowered the paper and looked directly at Richard. It is signed right here at the bottom in blue ink, I said, tapping the paper. Your exact legally binding signature. You literally begged my company not to throw you out onto the street so you could host this lavish party and trick Elijah's family into believing you were their financial equal. You used my property to stage a fraudulent display of wealth, and then you had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to hand me a catering apron and tell the owners of a $50 million Hamptons estate that I was just the maid. Richard looked as if all the bones in his body had suddenly dissolved. He sagged against the back of an expensive velvet armchair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He could not fight the paperwork. He could not scream his way out of a legally binding signature. The undeniable proof of his complete financial ruin and staggering hypocrisy was laid bare on the marble table for the entire world to see. Patricia began to sob openly, covering her face as the surrounding country club guests openly turned their backs, whispering harshly to one another, already planning their swift exits from the house of a disgraced fraud. Sydney stood completely paralyzed, her eyes locked in pure terror on Elijah, who was now looking at my father with an expression of cold, absolute disgust. The devastating finality of my father's signature on that hardship request hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on the entire room. The elite guests were no longer just whispering, they were actively turning their backs, forming a physical barrier of exclusion around my disgraced parents. But the true epicenter of the destruction had shifted. My eyes moved from the broken, wheezing figure of my father to the couple standing perfectly still near the massive stone fireplace. Elijah had not moved a muscle since I dropped the eviction documents onto the marble table. The brilliant surgeon possessed a mind trained to analyze complex systems, to identify the root cause of a disease and cut it out. Right now, he was analyzing the woman clinging desperately to his left arm. He looked down at Sydney, his dark eyes stripped of all previous warmth and affection. The romantic illusion was dead, replaced by the chilling, sterile detachment of a man examining a highly toxic specimen. Sydney felt the catastrophic shift in his demeanor. She tightened her grip on his tailored suit jacket, her knuckles turning bone white against the dark charcoal fabric. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and swimming with frantic manufactured tears. "Elijah, please," Sydney whimpered, her voice trembling with a pathetic, practiced fragility. "You cannot possibly believe this vicious lie. She is making it all sound so much worse than it is. My father just had a temporary cash flow problem. It is normal in big business. She is just twisting the facts to humiliate us, because she has always been so deeply, insanely jealous of me and the life we are building together. Elijah did not reach out to comfort her. He did not wrap his arm around her shaking shoulders to shield her from the staring crowd. Instead, with a slow and deliberate motion, he reached across his body and firmly detached her fingers from his lapel. The physical rejection was absolute and undeniable. Sydney gasped, staggering back a half step as if he had physically struck her across the face. "A temporary cash flow problem," Elijah repeated. His voice was incredibly low, yet it carried an unmistakable resonant authority that commanded the attention of everyone standing nearby. He looked at the red stamped folder on the table, then back to my sister's pale, terrified face. "That is a very interesting way to describe a formalized bank foreclosure and $100,000 rental deficit, Sydney. But that is not what concerns me the most right now. What concerns me is the conversation we had with my parents just 3 nights ago over dinner at our country club." Sydney swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the suffocating silence. "I do not know what you mean, baby," she stammered, fresh tears spilling over her dark eyelashes, her voice pitching higher in panic. "I am talking about the specific, detailed plans you laid out for our future." Elijah continued, his tone hardening into a surgical blade. "You looked my mother directly in the eye and told her that this exact 2-acre estate was your guaranteed inheritance. You boasted that the deed was already transitioning into an irrevocable trust entirely under your name. You explicitly stated that this house with its imported marble and crystal chandeliers would be the primary residence where we would raise our future children, provided entirely by your family's massive generational wealth." The sheer audacity of her lies hung between them, a massive, unscalable wall of deceit. I watched Winston and Josephine exchange a glance of profound, visceral disgust. Old money families despised nothing more than a social climber masquerading as an equal. The sheer embarrassment of having almost welcomed this fraudulent, manipulative woman into their prestigious lineage was radiating from Josephine's rigid posture. I did not know Sydney cried out, her pitch rising hysterically as she realized the walls were closing in and there was no escape. "I swear to you, Elijah, I had absolutely no idea. My father handles all the corporate finances. He told me the house was mine. He told me the business was thriving. I am a victim here too. She is just a cruel, vindictive monster coming in here to ruin the happiest night of my life out of pure spite because she has nothing of her own." "You are lying," Elijah stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "You are standing in front of me, in front of my parents, and you are still lying to my face. When we were choosing the floral arrangements for tonight, you complained to me about the catering budget. You looked me in the eye and told me you had to personally authorize a transfer from your private family trust to cover the exorbitant costs because your father was restructuring his liquid assets. If you were authorizing transfers from a trust, you knew exactly what the financial reality was. You knew there was no trust fund. You knew this house belonged to a private equity firm. You knowingly, willingly brought my parents into a rented, foreclosed property and paraded around like an heiress." Sydney was completely cornered. The surgical precision of his logic left her no room to maneuver, no shadows to hide her deceit. The mask of the sweet, innocent bride to be dissolved entirely, revealing the ugly, venomous core of the golden child who had just been denied her ultimate prize. She whipped her head around to face me, her features contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward, her expensive silk gown tangling around her legs, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "This is all your fault," Sydney screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. Her voice was a shrill, piercing shriek that echoed terribly in the grand hall. "You planned this. You waited for the most important night of my entire life just to walk in here and destroy everything. You could not stand the fact that I was marrying into a billionaire family while you were busy working yourself to the bone. You have always been a bitter, jealous, pathetic loser. You could never get a man like Elijah, so you decided to burn my life to the ground. Her voice broke on the final word, deteriorating into an ugly, guttural sob. She looked back at Elijah, a desperate, wild look in her eyes. She is a sociopath, Elijah. She got kicked out of this family because she is toxic. She is a cancer. You have to choose me. You promised to love me. Elijah looked at the screaming, red-faced woman throwing a spectacular, childish tantrum in the middle of a high society gathering. Then he looked at me. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in her hysterical screaming match. The contrast between my icy corporate composure and Sydney's unhinged, desperate meltdown was the final piece of evidence he needed. I do not need to destroy your life, Sydney, I said quietly, my voice carrying effortlessly over her sobbing. You built your entire life on a foundation of lies, stolen credit, and fake wealth. I simply turned on the lights. Elijah slowly shook his head, a look of profound, chilling finality settling over his handsome features. He had seen the absolute truth, and the elegant, wealthy illusion Sydney had woven was shattered forever. The total collapse of Sydney's facade left a gaping vacuum in the center of the room. My younger sister stood shivering, her face streaked with ruined mascara, completely stripped of her golden child armor. Elijah had stepped away from her, his rejection a silent, impenetrable wall. The wealthy guests who had been sipping champagne just an hour ago were now completely captivated by the brutal destruction of my family's social standing. It was a disaster from which there was no recovery, but my mother was a woman who refused to die quietly. Patricia had spent 30 years climbing the social ladder, clawing her way into country club memberships and charity gala committees. She knew that anger and aggression had failed. Richard's shouting had only made him look like a deranged fraud. Sydney's hysterical screaming had only exposed her as a toxic, entitled brat. Patricia realized instantly that the only weapon she had left in her arsenal was pity. I watched the exact second my mother switched tactics. It was a masterful, terrifying display of psychological manipulation. The rigid, furious tension melted out of her shoulders. Her knees buckled slightly, making her appear suddenly frail and elderly. She let out a ragged, heartbreaking sob that echoed loudly in the cavernous living room. She covered her face with her hands, her diamond rings catching the light as she began to weep. These were not the angry, frustrated tears of a woman caught in a lie. These were the deep, agonizing sobs of a heartbroken mother. "Josephine, please!" Patricia cried out, her voice trembling violently as she took a hesitant step toward Elijah's mother. "You have to listen to me. Mother to mother, I am begging you to hear the actual truth. We are not frauds. We are not criminals trying to trick your wonderful son. We are just parents. We are broken, desperate parents who sacrificed absolutely everything we had for a child who turned around and destroyed us." Patricia lowered her hands, letting the guests see the tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. She pointed a shaking finger at me, but her eyes remained locked on Josephine, playing the ultimate victim card. "You look at Vivian, and you see a brilliant, self-made billionaire." Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking with perfectly calculated emotion. "You see a chief executive officer who built an empire from the ground up. But you do not know the price that was paid for her success. You do not know whose blood, sweat, and tears paved the way for her to stand in this room today." I did not interrupt her. I stood perfectly still next to the marble coffee table, watching my mother weave the most audacious, despicable lie of her entire life. "Harrison." My legal assistant shifted slightly beside me, but a quick glance from me kept him silent. I wanted her to dig the hole as deep as possible. "We had a thriving business," Patricia continued, turning her tear-stained face to the crowd of guests, ensuring her tragic narrative reached the ears of every local socialite. "Richard's import company was incredibly successful. We were wealthy, secure, and happy. But Vivian was always so demanding. From the time she was a teenager, she demanded the absolute best. She wanted to attend an elite, out-of-state university. She wanted private tutors. She wanted to live in the most expensive neighborhoods. And when she decided she wanted to start a financial firm instead of going to law school, she demanded seed capital. Richard, catching on to his wife's desperate strategy, immediately slumped his shoulders. He let out a heavy, tragic sigh, wrapping his arm around Patricia to physically support his weeping wife. He bowed his head, playing the role of the selfless, broken patriarch who had given his last dime to his ungrateful offspring. We could not say no to our own daughter, Patricia wailed, burying her face in Richard's chest for a brief moment before looking back at the crowd. We liquidated our retirement accounts. Richard took out massive high-interest business loans against his import company. We even took out a second mortgage on this beautiful estate, the home where we raised our children. We drained every single drop of liquidity we had to fund her aggressive business ventures. We gave her the millions she needed to start Pinnacle Holdings. We bankrupted our entire family just to see her dreams come true. The room grew incredibly tense. The narrative was shifting. The wealthy guests, many of whom were parents themselves, naturally understood the instinct to provide for a child. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the judgmental stares previously aimed at my parents were now turning toward me. Patricia was painting a devastating picture of a sociopathic parasitic daughter who had bled her family dry and then gleefully watched them sink into poverty. And what did she do the second she became a billionaire? Patricia shouted, her voice laced with righteous maternal agony. She abandoned us. She took the money, built her empire, and completely cut ties. She left her father drowning in the corporate debt he took out specifically for her. She let the bank foreclose on her childhood home without offering a single penny to help us. She let us starve while she bought up real estate in the Hamptons. And now she comes into our home on the night of her sister's engagement, buying up our defaulted debt just to humiliate us and throw us out onto the street. Patricia collapsed against Richard, sobbing loudly, painting the ultimate portrait of a family destroyed by an ungrateful, narcissistic child. Sydney immediately joined in, crying softly, leaning against her mother to complete the tragic tableau. "See what she is?" Sydney whimpered, looking desperately at Elijah. "I told you she was a monster. She stole everything from our parents. She is the reason we are broke." The manipulation was incredibly potent. It played perfectly on the social anxieties of the elite crowd. For a few agonizing seconds, the grand living room was perfectly primed to turn against me. Even Winston and Josephine, seasoned billionaires who despised liars, frowned slightly. The accusation was heavy. If I had truly taken my parents' money to build my wealth and then abandoned them to foreclosure, my actions tonight would not be a victory. They would be a display of extreme, unforgivable cruelty. Elijah looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face for a reaction. He was waiting to see if the impenetrable corporate armor would crack under the weight of a mother's heartbreak. I looked at Patricia clinging to Richard, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs. I looked at the country club guests, whispering behind their hands. I looked at Sydney playing the traumatized sister. Then I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not a defensive smile. It was a cold, terrifying smirk that reached all the way to my eyes. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of my mother's lie was almost poetic. She had just publicly claimed that they sacrificed their entire fortune to fund my education and my business. She had just explicitly tied my success to their financial ruin. It was the exact perfect opening I had been waiting for. I did not raise my voice defensively. I did not scramble to deny her accusations. I simply turned my head and looked at Harrison. My legal assistant did not need a verbal command. He knew exactly what was inside the red-stamped folder resting on the marble table. Harrison stepped forward, reaching past the foreclosure documents, and pulled out a separate, remarkably thick stack of banking records that had been buried at the very bottom of the envelope. The paper was old, slightly yellowed at the edges, representing financial history that my parents desperately believed had been buried forever. I took the stack of old bank statements from Harrison. The satisfying weight of the paper in my hands was the promise of absolute, inescapable destruction. My mother wanted to talk about my college tuition. She wanted to talk about parental sacrifice. I looked directly at Patricia, my smirk widening into a look of predatory anticipation. I prepared to deliver the final fatal strike that would obliterate their past, their present, and their future. You truly missed your calling in Hollywood, Mom. I spoke, my voice echoing with lethal calmness across the vast living room. The sheer commitment to the performance is breathtaking. But as I said before, numbers do not care about your tears. They do not care about your tragic narrative, and they certainly do not lie. I held up the thick stack of yellowed banking records, ensuring the official crest of the financial institution was visible to everyone in the room, especially to Winston and Josephine. I did not throw the papers in her face. That would be chaotic and highly unprofessional. Instead, I separated the top 3 pages and laid them methodically over the foreclosure documents on the marble table. These are certified financial statements from Vanguard National Bank, dated exactly 10 years ago, I announced. This specific account was a dedicated educational trust fund, established under my name when I was a child. By the time I turned 18 and received my acceptance letter to Columbia University, this account held exactly $250,000. It was more than enough to cover my entire tuition, housing, and living expenses. I never needed to ask you for a single dime. I never demanded seed capital for a business. All I needed was the money that already belonged to me. Patricia had completely stopped crying. Her mouth hung slightly open, her eyes locked onto the yellowed paper like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike. The fake sobs had vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid, breathless panic. She looked like a woman who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the internal mechanism click. But when the tuition deadline arrived, I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. My payment was declined due to insufficient funds. I went to the bank myself to investigate the error. That is when the branch manager printed these exact statements for me. I discovered that over the course of 3 short months, my entire educational trust had been systematically drained down to a balance of $42.15. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the elite crowd. Stealing from a child's education fund was a line even the most ruthless corporate sharks in the room found repulsive. Winston narrowed his eyes, his posture stiffening with absolute disgust. I picked up the first highlighted page. Let us review the massive sacrifices you made for my future, shall we? On August 12th, there was a direct wire transfer of $85,000 to a luxury exotic car dealership in downtown Chicago. I turned my gaze slowly toward my younger sister. Sydney shrank back desperately, trying to hide behind Elijah, but he immediately stepped aside, leaving her completely exposed. He looked at her with a chilling clinical detachment, putting the pieces together. "Tell me, Sydney," I asked softly, letting the question hang in the cold air. "What exact day did you turn 18? And what exact car did you drive to school the very next morning?" It was a pristine custom, ordered white Porsche 911, was it not? Sydney squeezed her eyes shut, her face flushing with a mixture of profound guilt and absolute terror. She could not speak. She simply shook her head in a pathetic attempt to deny the undeniable, her hands trembling violently against her custom silk dress. My mother gasped, clutching Richard's arm again, but Richard was physically trembling now. He knew exactly what the next page contained. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner reach for the lever. "Then we have the second major sacrifice," I said, picking up the next highlighted document. On October 3rd, exactly 2 weeks before my tuition was due, $120,000 was wired to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. A holding company that federal regulators have repeatedly flagged for processing high-stakes gambling debts for VIP casino clients. I looked directly at my father. "You did not take out business loans to fund my dreams, Richard," I stated, stripping him of the title of father permanently. "You liquidated my future to pay off your degenerate blackjack losses because the people you owed money to were threatening to break your legs." You stole from your own daughter to save your pathetic skin and buy your golden child a sports car so you could maintain your wealthy facade at the country club. Patricia stepped forward, her hands raised in a frantic shaking gesture. Vivian, please, you are taking this completely out of context. We were going to replace the money. We hit a rough patch and we just needed to borrow it temporarily. We were your parents. We had the legal right to manage those funds for the household. You had the legal access, I corrected sharply, stepping closer to the table, my presence dominating the space. But you had absolutely no moral or legal right to embezzle it. And when I confronted you both with these exact bank statements 10 years ago, you did not apologize. You did not promise to pay it back. You panicked. You realized that if I went to the authorities, you would face wire fraud and embezzlement charges. The room was so quiet that the sound of Patricia's rapid, shallow breathing was the only noise. Josephine crossed her arms, her face a mask of furious contempt, as she stared down the woman who had just tried to manipulate her with fake tears. So you did what cowards always do. I continued, refusing to break eye contact with Patricia. You launched a preemptive strike. You packed my belongings into 2 trash bags and threw them onto the front porch in the middle of a November rainstorm. You confiscated my house keys. You cut off my phone. And then you spent the next decade telling everyone in your social circle that I was a rebellious, ungrateful failure who dropped out of college and ran away because I could not handle the pressure. You spun a brilliant, tragic narrative to cover up the fact that you are nothing but common thieves. I looked at the crowd, then back at Elijah and his parents, ensuring they understood the complete, unvarnished truth. I did not drop out. I was starved out. I spent my first winter away from this house sleeping on the floor of a 24-hour laundromat because I had no money for rent. I worked 3 minimum wage shifts a day just to afford community college night classes. I built Pinnacle Holdings not with your non-existent seed capital, but with the ruthless, unrelenting drive of a woman who learned early on that the only person she could ever trust was herself. I dropped the final bank statement back onto the marble table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud that felt like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. You did not sacrifice your wealth for me, Patricia, I said, my voice echoing with finality. You sacrificed me for your wealth. And the most beautiful poetic justice of all is that the very daughter you threw into the gutter to protect your fake empire is the exact same woman who just returned to legally repossess it. The echo of my final words seemed to embed itself into the very foundation of the room. The yellowed bank statements lay on the marble table like a signed confession, impossible to refute and completely devastating. Richard and Patricia were utterly paralyzed, stripped of their weapons, their gaslighting, and their fabricated victimhood. The surrounding country club guessed the exact same people who had been drinking my father's expensive champagne just an hour ago were now physically backing away. It was a synchronized retreat, a collective silent severing of all social ties. But the most terrifying judgment did not come from the whispering, judgmental crowd. It came from the 2 people my parents had desperately tried to impress all night. Josephine moved first. She did not raise her hands in shock or gasp like the lesser socialites in the room. She possessed the formidable quiet strength of a woman whose lineage had navigated centuries of genuine adversity to build a lasting, legitimate empire. She stepped over to the marble table, her emerald gown catching the light, and looked down at the financial records. Then she slowly raised her gaze to meet my mother's terrified, tear-stained face. The polite, engaging smile Josephine had worn since she arrived was entirely gone. In its place was a mask of absolute, chilling contempt. You tried to look me in the eye and manipulate my maternal instincts, Josephine stated, her voice smooth, but carrying the lethal edge of a polished blade. You dared to use the concept of a mother's sacrifice as a shield for your own greed. I have sat on the boards of dozens of philanthropic organizations. I have seen desperate parents sacrifice their own meals to ensure their children have a future. What you did was not a sacrifice. It was an act of profound, unforgivable parasitism. Patricia let out a pathetic, suffocated whine, reaching a trembling hand out toward Josephine, as if begging for a lifeline. Josephine, please, you must understand the immense pressure we were under. The business was struggling. We had a certain lifestyle to maintain for the girls. We had to keep up appearances. Do not insult me by trying to justify theft with a country club membership, Josephine snapped, cutting her off with brutal efficiency. You stole from a vulnerable child to buy a sports car and fund a gambling addiction. You stripped your own daughter of her safety net to maintain a pathetic, hollow illusion of superiority. And then you had the sheer audacity to stand in my presence and call her a parasite. The only parasites in this room are the ones currently facing eviction. Richard tried to step in front of his wife, attempting one last desperate display of patriarchal authority. He puffed out his chest, though his broad shoulders were visibly shaking. Winston, listen to reason, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, panicked register. This is a private family matter that has been blown entirely out of proportion by an estranged, bitter daughter. We can sit down in my private study, have a glass of scotch, and discuss the business implications of this engagement man to man. Winston did not move. He stood incredibly tall, his presence dominating the space, without requiring a single raised decibel. He looked at Richard not as an equal, not even as an opponent, but as something entirely insignificant and repulsive. We will not be discussing anything, Richard, Winston said, his deep voice resonating with absolute unwavering finality. Because there is no engagement to discuss. Sydney let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, grabbing the fabric of her expensive dress. Richard staggered backward, his mouth falling open. Winston, you cannot possibly mean that. You cannot let a temporary business dispute ruin the love between our children. We are merging two great families. Winston took a deliberate step forward, forcing Richard to cower backward. We are not merging anything, Winston replied coldly. My family worked for generations to build a legacy rooted in absolute integrity, relentless hard work, and unyielding honor. We built our empire through legitimate sweat and blood, not by embezzling from our own children. You invited us into a foreclosed home, fed us outrageous lies, and tried to marry your daughter into our wealth to save yourselves from the financial ruin you alone orchestrated. Winston paused, letting his intense gaze sweep over Richard, Patricia, and Sydney with unvarnished disgust. My family may be extraordinarily rich, Richard. We have the resources to buy and sell men like you 100 times over. But we have standards. We will never under any circumstances welcome or associate with thieves who steal from their own blood. The declaration was absolute. It was not just a rejection of the marriage, it was a permanent excommunication from the elite world my parents had sacrificed my entire future to be a part of. The sheer crushing weight of Winston's disdain broke whatever fragile, delusional spirit Richard had left. His knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a velvet dining chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the polished marble floor. Patricia buried her face in her hands, no longer faking her dramatic sobs. The reality of her total destruction had finally set in. She had lost her foreclosed mansion. She had lost her fragile social standing. And she had just lost the billionaire lifeline she was depending on to save them from living on the streets. The people she had desperately wanted to court, the elite, dignified family she had tried to impress by forcing me into a maid's apron, had just ground her entire existence into dust beneath their heels. I stood quietly beside Harrison, watching the complete, irreversible annihilation of the monsters who had terrorized my youth. I did not need to shout. I did not need to gloat or point fingers. Winston and Josephine had done exactly what I knew people of genuine class and unshakable morals would do when faced with undeniable fraud. They had rejected the rot. The perfect, happy family facade was entirely dead, and its corpse was laid out on the marble floor for everyone to step over as the guests began rushing toward the exit. The focus in the grand living room violently shifted from the disgraced patriarch to the crumbling golden child. Sydney stood completely isolated near the towering stone fireplace. The glamorous, untouchable bride-to-be was gone. In her place stood a terrified, hyperventilating fraud, whose entire future was evaporating before her eyes. She looked frantically between the retreating backs of the wealthy guests and the rigid, unyielding posture of the man she thought was her ultimate salvation. Elijah had remained perfectly silent during his father's devastating execution of my parents' social standing. He possessed the terrifying, disciplined calm of a trauma surgeon operating under immense pressure. He did not yell. He did not wave his arms. He simply looked at Sydney. The absolute void of emotion in his dark eyes was infinitely more terrifying than any screaming match could ever be. "Elijah, please," Sydney gasped, her voice breaking into a wet, desperate wheeze. She lunged forward, closing the small gap between them, her hands frantically grasping at the lapels of his custom charcoal suit. "You have to listen to me. You have to understand. I was just a child when all of that financial stuff happened. I did not know they stole Vivian's money. I did not know the house was foreclosed. I am a victim of their lies too. You cannot blame me for the sins of my parents. We love each other. We are getting married." She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing violently, hoping to trigger his protective instincts. She expected him to wrap his strong arms around her, to pull her away from the nightmare, to shield her from the brutal reality of her family's collapse. Elijah did not move a single muscle. His arms remained at his sides. He looked down at the sobbing woman clinging to his suit, his expression hardening into a mask of pure clinical rejection. "Take your hands off me, Sydney," Elijah commanded. His voice was incredibly low, yet it vibrated with a lethal authority that echoed clearly across the silent room. Sydney froze. She slowly lifted her tear-stained face, her eyes wide with pure terror. She released his lapels, her hands shaking so violently that her heavy, flawless diamond engagement ring caught the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers, sending fractured rainbows across the dark fabric of his suit. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the innocent victim," Elijah continued, his tone slicing through her pathetic performance. "You claim you did not know about the stolen tuition money, but you certainly knew exactly what you were doing when you demanded Vivian put on a catering apron tonight. You knew exactly what you were doing when you stood there and smirked while your father degraded her as a maid in front of my parents. You actively participated in her public execution because it made you feel powerful." Sydney opened her mouth, a desperate, high-pitched whine escaping her throat, but no coherent words formed. "I am a doctor," Sydney Elijah stated, his words measured and precise. "I spend my life trying to heal people, trying to save families from being torn apart by tragedy. I took an oath to do no harm, and I am standing here looking at a woman who finds joy in inflicting maximum psychological harm on her own biological sister. You did not just benefit from her abuse. You reveled in it. You wore the sports car bought with her stolen future like a badge of honor. You flaunted this rented, foreclosed mansion like you were an heiress." He took a slow, deliberate step backward, completely severing the physical and emotional tether between them. A marriage is a partnership built on absolute trust, mutual respect, and a shared moral foundation. Elijah declared, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "I cannot and I will not bind my life, my reputation, or my family's legacy to a woman capable of such breathtaking deceit and profound cruelty. If you can stand by and gleefully participate in the destruction of your own flesh and blood, I can only imagine the knife you would eventually drive into my back when it suited your selfish needs." "No, Sydney," shrieked the sound, tearing through the room like a siren. "No, Elijah. You cannot do this. The invitations are sent. The venue is booked. You promised me." Elijah extended his right hand, his palm facing upward. The gesture was simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless. "The ring, Sydney. Take it off. Right now." The command struck her like a physical blow to the chest. Sydney staggered backward, clutching her left hand to her chest, as if trying to physically protect the diamond from his demand. She shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair flying in every direction, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "No," she sobbed, backing away. "It is mine. You gave it to me. You cannot take it back. We can fix this. We can go to counseling." I will apologize to Vivian. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not leave me. I do not want your fake apologies, Elijah replied coldly. And I certainly do not want a future with a fraud. Take the ring off, Sydney. Do not make me ask you again in front of this entire room. The absolute unyielding coldness in his eyes finally broke her. She realized with terrifying certainty that there was no manipulation, no tears, no dramatic plea that could save her. The billionaire surgeon, the golden ticket that was supposed to elevate her above the ruins of her family's fake empire, was entirely gone. With trembling, uncoordinated fingers, Sydney reached for her left hand. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail as she slowly slid the massive diamond ring off her finger. The symbol of her ultimate victory, the very object she had shoved in my face since the moment she got engaged, was now the instrument of her total destruction. She held the ring out her hand, shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Elijah did not reach out to take it from her. He did not want to touch her hands again. Put it on the table, he ordered, gesturing to the marble coffee table, where my foreclosure documents and bank statements still rested. Put it right next to the evidence of your family's actual worth. Sydney stumbled forward. Her knees buckled and she practically collapsed against the edge of the marble table. She dropped the heavy diamond ring onto the cold stone surface. It landed with a sharp, hollow clink right on top of the yellowed bank statements that detailed her stolen Porsche. The wedding is officially canceled, Elijah announced, his voice ringing with absolute, irreversible authority. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my family again. The finality of his words acted as a physical execution. Sydney let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated agony. The golden child, the spoiled, vicious princess who had spent her entire life dancing on my pain, completely shattered. Her legs gave out entirely, and she collapsed onto the imported rug, her custom silk gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. She slammed her fists against the floor, sobbing hysterically, screaming Elijah's name into the floorboards, her voice cracking and breaking in total despair. I stood quietly beside Harrison, watching the total magnificent destruction of my sister's fabricated reality. She had lost her billionaire husband. She had lost her fake mansion. She had lost her entire future. And she had lost it all, right in front of the high society crowd she had spent her life desperately trying to impress. The karma was absolute, precise, and flawlessly executed. The sound of Sydney weeping on the floor abruptly changed. The pathetic, gasping sobs of a broken bride dissolved, replaced by a low, guttural sound of pure, unhinged fury. She realized that Elijah was never coming back. The billionaire lifestyle, the private jets, the endless credit cards, they were all gone forever. And standing just a few feet away, perfectly composed and entirely victorious, was the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on. Sydney pushed herself off the imported rug. Her custom silk gown was wrinkled and stained with her own tears, the delicate fabric tearing slightly as the heel of her designer shoe caught the hem. She did not care. Her face was a terrifying mask of smeared mascara and raw, feral hatred. She locked her wild, bloodshot eyes onto me. You did this to me! Sydney shrieked, her voice scraping against the walls of the grand living room like jagged metal. You planned this entire thing just to ruin my life. You ugly, jealous, pathetic loser! Without a single second of warning, she charged. She launched herself across the polished marble floor, her arm raised high, her fingers curled into rigid claws. She was aiming directly for my face, fully intending to slap the absolute life out of me, to leave physical marks of her rage on my skin, just as she had tried to leave emotional scars on my soul for decades. I did not take a step back. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I simply watched her come, my expression completely detached, tracking her erratic movement with the cold calculation of someone observing a rabid animal. But Sydney never reached me. Before she could even close the distance, Elijah moved. The elite surgeon possessed reflexes honed by years of operating under intense life-or-death pressure. He stepped smoothly and decisively across my line of sight, placing his tall, broad frame directly between me and my sister. As Sydney brought her hand down in a vicious arc, Elijah caught her wrist mid-swing. His grip was not violent, but it was an absolute immovable vice of solid muscle and bone. "Do not even think about touching her," Elijah commanded. His voice was no longer just authoritative, it was a lethal, vibrating threat that froze the very air in the room. Sydney gasped, her momentum completely arrested by his iron grip. She struggled uselessly against his hold, panting like a cornered beast, her eyes wide with shock that the man who had kissed her just hours ago was now treating her like a physical threat to another woman. Immediately beside him, Winston also stepped forward. The billionaire patriarch moved with the quiet, formidable power of a mountain sliding into place. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his son, forming an impenetrable solid wall of elite protection right in front of me. Winston did not lay a hand on Sydney, but his imposing presence and the dark, furious warning in his eyes were enough to make her physically shrink back. "You will stand down this instant, young lady," Winston stated, his deep voice rolling through the silent crowd like distant thunder. "You have humiliated yourself enough for one lifetime. If you attempt to lay a single finger on Ms. Vivian, I personally guarantee the legal and financial consequences will follow you until the day you die." Elijah released her wrist with a sharp, dismissive flick of his hand, as if he had just touched something deeply unsanitary. Sydney stumbled backward, cradling her arm against her chest heaving with humiliated rage as she realized she was completely powerless. Seeing his golden child physically intercepted and openly threatened by the men he had been trying to impress, Richard completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. The destruction of his fake empire and the loss of the billionaire marriage had pushed him into a state of sheer frantic delusion. He stomped forward, his face slick with sweat, his jaw jutting out in a pathetic display of fake bravado. "How dare you put your hands on my daughter?" Richard roared at Elijah, though he kept a very safe distance from Winston. Then he turned his manic, bulging eyes toward me. He raised a shaking, thick finger and pointed it directly at my face, a gesture he had used 1,000 times during my childhood to demand my absolute submission. "This is all your fault, you vindictive, sociopathic monster," Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You orchestrated this entire circus just to humiliate us in front of our guests. You brought forged documents into my home to commit corporate sabotage and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I am going to sue you for every single penny you have. I am calling my legal team right now. We will drag you into court for defamation, for slander, for tortious interference. You have destroyed the honor of this family, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a jail cell or drowning in litigation." The threats echoed loudly against the crystal chandeliers, angry and violent. Patricia nodded eagerly behind him, her hands clasped together in desperate agreement, clinging to the false hope that expensive lawyers could somehow erase the devastating truth I had just exposed. I stood perfectly safe behind the protective barrier of Winston and Elijah. I looked at my father, a man desperately threatening me with imaginary lawyers funded by imaginary money to protect an imaginary honor. I listened to his frantic legal buzzwords, words he clearly did not understand, used merely as a scare tactic to force me back into my designated place at the bottom of his toxic hierarchy. For a few seconds I just stared at him, and then I laughed. It was not a nervous giggle. It was not a defensive scoff. It was a genuine, dark, resonant laugh that bubbled up from my chest and spilled out into the dead, silent room. The sound of my amusement was so completely out of place against his red-faced fury that it genuinely startled the remaining guests. Richard stopped screaming, his mouth hanging open in sheer confusion as my laughter echoed around him. I stepped smoothly around Elijah and Winston, placing myself back at the forefront of the battlefield. I did not need them to shield me from a man who had already defeated himself. "Honor," I repeated, shaking my head slowly, a chilling smile carving its way across my face. "You want to sue me for destroying the honor of a family that steals from its own children to pay off casino debts? You want to threaten me with a legal team when you cannot even afford to pay the utility bills on the house you are currently standing in?" I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, my eyes locking onto his panicked gaze with the unblinking focus of a sniper. You cannot sue someone for defamation when they are simply reading your own certified bank statements aloud. Dad, I stated, my voice dropping into a lethal corporate whisper. You cannot claim tortious interference when you are the one who forged your own financial projections. If you drag me into a courtroom, the only thing you will accomplish is making this private execution a matter of public record. You will be handing the district attorney a perfectly wrapped case for wire fraud and embezzlement on a silver platter. Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly. His hand slowly dropped to his side, his pointing finger curling back into a defeated, trembling fist. He realized with terrifying clarity that every single threat he made was completely empty, and I held all the cards. But since you are so incredibly eager to discuss legal proceedings and corporate maneuvers, I continued, my smile widening into something truly terrifying. I suppose now is the perfect time to address your employment status. I turned my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on the broken man in front of me, and gave Harrison a single sharp nod. It was time to deliver the final, fatal blow. Harrison stepped forward with the silent, lethal grace of a seasoned executioner. He did not reach for the red-stamped envelope on the marble coffee table. Instead, he opened his impeccably tailored suit jacket and withdrew a single crisp black folder from his inner breast pocket. The color of the folder was stark, uncompromising, and entirely devoid of the aggressive warning that the red foreclosure documents had carried. This was not a warning. This was an obituary. He handed the black folder to me with a sharp, respectful nod and stepped back, blending seamlessly into the periphery, as a good legal counsel always does when the chief executive officer is about to drop the guillotine. I took the folder, feeling the smooth, heavy cardstock beneath my fingertips. I did not open it immediately. I let the silence in the grand living room stretch, allowing the sheer, paralyzing anticipation to suffocate the remaining air from my father's lungs. Richard stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes tracking the black folder with the primal terror of a man who suddenly realizes the ground beneath him is entirely made of quicksand. You have spent your entire life defining your absolute worth by your corporate title. I began, my voice echoing with a cold, resonant authority that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. You used your position as the director of an import and export company to belittle my ambitions. You told me that women lacked the strategic ruthlessness required for high-level commerce. You built a toxic, fragile patriarchy on the assumption that you would always be the smartest, wealthiest, and most powerful person in the room. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Richard instinctively tried to step back, but his calves hit the edge of a heavy velvet armchair. He was physically and legally trapped. But arrogant men always make the same fatal miscalculation. I continued, my gaze locking onto his panicked, bloodshot eyes. They underestimate the very people they step on. You thought my reach ended at residential real estate. You thought Pinnacle Holdings was just a boutique firm sweeping up distressed mortgages in the suburbs. You failed to realize that Pinnacle Holdings is merely a subsidiary. It is just one small branch of a much larger, much more aggressive parent conglomerate that I built with the exact same ruthless precision you claimed I lacked. Patricia let out a high-pitched, strangled whimper. She reached out to grab her husband's sleeve, her diamond bracelets clanking noisily, but Richard did not even acknowledge her. He was completely mesmerized by the black folder in my hands, his breathing growing increasingly shallow and ragged. For the past 6 months, while you were busy funneling your dwindling operating capital into custom floral arrangements and catering deposits to secure Sydney's fraudulent marriage, my parent company was quietly acquiring your corporate debt, I stated, enunciating every single syllable so the reality of his failure would echo in his ears forever. We bought out your primary commercial lenders. We purchased the senior secured notes you defaulted on when your shipping containers were seized. And because you were so incredibly desperate for liquidity last year, you signed loan agreements with highly aggressive equity conversion clauses. Richard shook his head rapidly, a gesture of pure instinctual denial. No, he wheezed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. No, those covenants were restricted. The board would have to approve any equity transfer. You cannot just take the shares. I can, and I did. I replied, my smile carrying the absolute freezing temperature of a corporate slaughter. Because when a chief executive officer commits gross financial negligence and defaults on 3 consecutive quarters of structured debt, those restricted covenants dissolve. I flipped open the black folder and pulled out a stack of legally binding watermarked corporate resolutions. I held them up, ensuring the bold, undeniable signatures of his former board members were visible. Today, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while you were busy barking orders at the catering staff and forcing your daughter into a maid's apron, the financial markets closed, I announced, my voice ringing with total irreversible finality. At that exact minute, my conglomerate executed a hostile takeover. We converted your outstanding defaulted commercial debt into controlling equity. I am not just your landlord anymore, Richard. I am the absolute majority shareholder of your entire global enterprise. The room erupted into a flurry of shocked, chaotic whispers. The country club guests, the business associates, and the elite socialites were witnessing the complete systematic dismantling of a man's entire existence. Winston and Josephine watched me with profound, unblinking respect, recognizing the flawless, lethal execution of a perfect corporate checkmate. Elijah stood tall, his expression validating the sheer brilliance of the trap my father had blindly walked into. But I am not finished, I commanded, raising my hand slightly to silence the whispers. The room instantly quieted, eager to witness the final strike. As the new majority shareholder holding 72% of the voting rights, my very first order of business was to call an emergency board of directors meeting at 4:15 this afternoon. I continued, stepping right into my father's personal space. There was only one item on the agenda. It was a unanimous vote. I looked directly into his terrified, hyperventilating face and delivered the sentence that would strip him of his identity forever. "You are no longer the director of the company," I stated coldly. "You are not retiring. You are not stepping down to pursue philanthropic interests or spend more time with your family. You are officially effective, immediately fired." Richard let out a horrific, choking gasp, as if all the oxygen in the room had suddenly turned to ash. "You are terminated for cause." I drove the final nail into the coffin. Fired for gross financial mismanagement, continuous breach of fiduciary duty, and the deliberate misappropriation of corporate funds to maintain your lavish, fraudulent personal lifestyle. Your company car has been repossessed. Your corporate accounts have been frozen. Your access to the executive suites was revoked an hour ago. You have absolutely nothing left. The impact of those words was physical, brutal, and immediate. The towering, arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life terrorizing me completely disintegrated. Richard's eyes rolled back slightly. He let out a wet, agonizing groan, his hands flying up to clutch violently at the center of his chest. His face drained of all remaining color, turning a terrifying, translucent white. His knees buckled entirely. He could not support the weight of his own massive, devastating failure. Richard collapsed backward, falling heavily into the velvet armchair with a loud, pathetic thud. He slumped over, gasping for air, like a drowning man, his hands gripping his suit jacket over his heart, as the sheer, suffocating reality of his total ruin crushed him alive. Patricia screamed, dropping to her knees beside the chair, sobbing hysterically as the empire of lies they had built finally, irreversibly collapsed into absolute dust. The sound of my mother weeping over my father's slumped body was the only noise left in the sprawling living room. Richard was gasping for shallow breaths, his hands clutching the fabric of his ruined tuxedo. He was not having a heart attack, though I am sure the sheer panic made it feel like his chest was caving in. It was simply the physiological response of a massive ego being crushed under the weight of undeniable, legally binding consequences. Patricia looked wildly around the room, her tear-streaked face begging the elite guests for an ounce of sympathy. She found nothing but averted eyes and cold shoulders. In the brutal hierarchy of high society, financial contagion is treated like a lethal virus, and my family was officially patient zero. I did not offer them a moment to recover. In business, when your opponent is on the ground, you do not let them catch their breath. You finish the transaction. I turned my attention back to Harrison. My legal assistant anticipated my next move with flawless precision. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced one final document. It was not bound in a heavy folder or sealed with red wax. It was a single standard sheet of white legal paper, the kind printed by the thousands in county courthouses across the country. It was mundane, ordinary, and absolutely devastating. Harrison handed the paper to me. I held it lightly between my fingertips. I walked over to the marble coffee table, stepping carefully around the spot where my sister Sydney was still crumpled on the imported rug. I looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, worthless, and utterly disposable. I placed the single sheet of paper squarely in the center of the table, right on top of the foreclosure deed and the yellowed bank statements that proved their theft. "You both made a very poignant observation earlier this evening," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of my mother's sobbing. "You told Josephine and Winston that some people are simply born to be successful, and others are just meant to serve. You explicitly stated that you do not claim the help as your own blood. You wanted to make it absolutely clear that failures and servants do not belong in a house of this magnitude." I paused, letting their own cruel, arrogant words echo back at them. Richard slowly opened his eyes, his chest still heaving as he stared weakly at the paper on the table. Patricia froze, her hands hovering over her husband's shoulders, a new wave of dread washing over her features. "I completely agree with your assessment," I continued, my tone dropping into a freezing, razor-sharp register. "You are absolutely right. Failures and thieves do not belong in this estate, which is why I am officially serving you with a 30-day notice to vacate the premises." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Sydney let out a fresh, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands. Patricia shook her head violently, her heavily sprayed hair falling out of its elaborate updo. "Vivian, no!" Patricia pleaded, her voice cracking into a desperate guttural screech. "You cannot do this. This is our home. This is where we raised you. Where will we go? We have absolutely no money. You just took your father's entire company. You cannot throw your own family out onto the street." "I am not throwing my family onto the street," I replied with absolute, unyielding coldness. "I am initiating a standard legally mandated eviction process against delinquent tenants who have failed to pay their rent for 3 consecutive months. You forfeited your right to call yourselves my family 10 years ago when you stole my college tuition to fund your gambling habits and buy sports cars. You cemented that decision tonight when you handed me a catering apron and tried to degrade me in front of billionaires to stroke your own pathetic egos." I pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger at the document resting on the marble. "That is a formal court-approved eviction notice," I stated, making sure every syllable was crisp and clear. "Under the property laws of this state, you have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property. You will not take the furniture. You will not touch the artwork, the crystal chandeliers, or the imported fixtures because my holding company legally owns every single item inside these walls. You will take your clothes, you will take your personal effects, and you will walk out that front door." Richard tried to push himself up from the velvet armchair, his face a mask of trembling, sweaty desperation. He reached a shaking hand toward the paper, but he lacked the physical strength to even pick it up. "We can fight this." Richard wheezed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "We have tenant rights. We can request a stay of execution. We can file an appeal with the housing authority." "You have absolutely no legal recourse left," Richard, I countered, shutting down his final delusional escape route with ruthless efficiency. "Do you think my legal team would serve an eviction notice without securing an airtight judgment first? My attorneys already filed the emergency injunction based on your massive financial fraud and your proven inability to satisfy the lease agreement." The judge signed off on the expedited eviction order at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I took a step back, aligning myself with Harrison, presenting a unified, impenetrable front of corporate power. If you are not entirely off my property by midnight. On the 30th day, I informed them, my voice radiating pure, lethal authority. The county sheriff will arrive at dawn. They will not knock politely. They will forcibly remove you from the premises, change the locks, and dump whatever belongings you leave behind onto the curb. There is no negotiation. There is no extension. There is no backdoor settlement. The exit is right behind you, and the clock is officially ticking. The absolute finality of the law crashed down upon them, sealing off every possible avenue of survival. They had spent their entire lives manipulating the rules, using their fake wealth to bully and intimidate everyone around them. But they had finally met a force they could not manipulate, a system they could not bribe, and a daughter they could no longer control. The legal trap was sprung, the cage was locked, and they were left with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of their own complete destruction. The spectacle had reached its natural, devastating conclusion. The elite guests, having consumed their absolute fill of the carnage, began a rapid, synchronized exodus toward the grand foyer. Nobody offered a single word of comfort to the disgraced patriarch, gasping in the velvet armchair, or the women sobbing hysterically on the imported rug. In the brutal hierarchy of high society, financial failure was a highly contagious disease, and my family was officially terminal. In the center of the rapidly emptying room, Winston buttoned his tailored suit jacket and turned his full attention to me. There was no pity in his dark eyes, only the profound, unyielding respect of a fellow conqueror who had just watched a masterclass in corporate execution. Ms. Vivian Winston, said his deep voice cutting cleanly through the sounds of retreating footsteps. My family values absolute integrity and ruthless competence above all else. You have demonstrated a breathtaking mastery of both tonight. Our legal team will finalize the acquisition paperwork by Monday morning. We expect to see you at our executive board meeting on Wednesday to officially sign the new partnership contracts. You have earned a permanent seat at our table. Josephine stepped forward, her emerald gown catching the light one last time, and offered a firm professional handshake. It is a rare privilege to witness a woman reclaim her power with such flawless precision, she stated, her tone radiating genuine admiration. We look forward to a very long and highly profitable relationship. Elijah stood beside his parents. He did not look at Sydney. He did not spare a single glance for the sobbing, ruined woman he was supposed to marry. He looked directly at me, giving a sharp, deeply respectful nod. Brilliant, the elite surgeon said, and it was entirely enough. The three of them turned and walked out the heavy mahogany doors, taking the very last remnants of my family's social standing, their wealth, and their future with them. The heavy front doors clicked shut, with a resounding, irreversible thud. The grand living room was suddenly completely empty of outsiders. The hired catering staff had vanished into the kitchen, desperate to avoid the fallout. Harrison stood silently by the doorway, a stone sentinel waiting for my final command. I looked down at the wreckage. Patricia and Sydney realized the audience was gone. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no one left to impress with fake tears or tragic narratives. The sheer crushing reality of their impending homelessness crashed down upon them like a collapsing building. Patricia moved first. She scrambled across the polished marble floor on her hands and knees. The delicate fabric of her expensive designer gown tore against a sharp edge of the coffee table, but she did not care. She lunged forward, throwing her arms violently around my lower legs. Her heavy, unpaid diamond bracelets dug painfully into my shins as she buried her face against my knees. "Vivian, please," Patricia wailed, her voice a wet, agonizing shriek that tore at her throat. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot leave your own mother with absolutely nothing. I carried you. I gave birth to you. We are blood. I am so incredibly sorry. I was wrong. I was so blinded by the pressure, by the debt, by your father. I will do anything you want. I will clean your houses. I will work for you. Just please, please do not throw us out onto the street. We will not survive out there." Sydney, seeing her mother groveling pathetically on the floor, immediately followed suit. The former golden child crawled forward, her tear-stained face a grotesque mask of pure terror. She grabbed my other leg, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the expensive fabric of my dress, clinging to me like a drowning victim. "Vivian, I am sorry," Sydney sobbed, her chest heaving violently as she gasped for air. "I am so sorry I was cruel to you. I was jealous. I was always so insanely jealous of how smart and independent you were. I will sign whatever legal documents you want. I will give up my share of everything. Just let me stay here. Please, I have absolutely nowhere else to go. You are my big sister. You are supposed to protect me." Their tears soaked into the hem of my dress. Their desperate, frantic grasping felt like the pathetic thrashing of trapped animals. 10 years ago, the sight of my mother and sister crying at my feet begging for my protection would have broken my heart into a million pieces. I would have instantly caved, offering them my money, my home, and my endless forgiveness, just to receive a tiny fabricated fraction of their love. But the woman standing in that living room was not the terrified, broken college student they had thrown into the freezing rain. I looked down at the tops of their heads. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the warmth of familial forgiveness. I felt absolutely nothing. With a swift, aggressive, and highly calculated motion, I took a hard step backward. I physically ripped my legs out of their desperate grasp. Patricia let out a sharp cry as her hands hit the cold, hard marble floor. Sydney scrambled forward, reaching her hands out to grab my ankles again. But I raised my hand in a gesture of pure lethal command that froze her instantly in her tracks. "Do not dare touch me," I commanded, my voice echoing with freezing, irreversible finality. "Do not dare weaponize the concept of blood and family after you spent decades treating me like a disposable financial asset." I looked at Patricia's terrified, weeping face, then at Sydney's shattered, ruined expression. "You are not sorry that you stole my college tuition," I stated coldly, dissecting their pathetic apologies with surgical precision. "You are not sorry that you kicked me out to starve in a laundromat. You are not sorry that you handed me a catering apron and tried to humiliate me tonight. You are only sorry that you miscalculated my net worth. You are only sorry that the billionaire family you tried to scam walked out that door. You are only sorry because you finally got caught and you know I possess the absolute power to destroy you." Patricia opened her mouth to beg again, but the icy glare in my eyes silenced her completely. "There is no redemption here." I finalized my tone, stripping away their last microscopic shred of hope. "There is no emotional reconciliation. You traded your daughter for a sports car and a country club membership. You made your transaction 10 years ago. Today, the invoice simply came due. I reject your apologies, and I reject your existence in my life. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. If I find a single scratch on the Italian marble when my property managers arrive, I will sue you for damages on top of the eviction." I turned my back on them, refusing to give them another second of my time. They were no longer my family. They were just delinquent tenants, and their lease was officially terminated. I looked down at the black catering apron resting on the polished marble floor. It was a simple, cheap piece of fabric, yet an hour ago, it had represented every single degrading expectation my family had ever tried to force upon my shoulders. It was the physical embodiment of their desperate need to keep me beneath them. I bent down with deliberate, unhurried grace and picked it up. Behind me, the pathetic, agonizing sounds of my mother and sister weeping continued to echo against the stone walls. Patricia was still hyperventilating on the imported rug, and Sydney was curled into a tight, trembling ball of sheer panic. Richard remained paralyzed in the velvet armchair, a hollow, broken shell of a man staring blankly at the eviction notice that had just ended his entire universe. I did not offer them a parting glance. I did not offer them a final word of advice. Instead, I walked over to the custom-imported Italian velvet sofa that my mother had spent the entire evening boasting about to her elite country club friends. With a swift, careless flick of my wrist, I tossed the stained catering apron directly onto the pristine, expensive upholstery. It landed right in the center, a stark, ugly, dark stain completely ruining their fabricated perfection. It was the perfect parting gift for my new delinquent tenants. A physical reminder of exactly where they belonged now, and a symbol of the servitude they would soon experience in the real world. I turned my back on the catastrophic wreckage of my biological family and began walking toward the grand foyer. My designer heels clicked against the marble in a steady, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm cadence. The sharp sound of my footsteps easily cut through the pathetic, echoing wails of the women behind me. I did not turn around. I did not look over my shoulder to witness their pain one last time. In the ruthless, high-stakes world of corporate finance, you never look back at a closed, finalized deal. You only look forward to the next massive acquisition. The hired catering staff who had witnessed the entire brutal public execution from the shadows of the hallways parted silently as I approached. They did not whisper or gossip. They stood with their heads slightly bowed, their hands clasped respectfully in front of them, offering a level of genuine unspoken deference that my parents had never once earned in their miserable lives. They recognized a true titan when they saw one. Harrison walked half a step behind me, the perfect embodiment of corporate loyalty, ruthless efficiency, and lethal legal protection. As we reached the towering mahogany front doors, he stepped forward and pulled the heavy brass handle. The doors swung open, and the crisp, cool night air hit my face instantly. It carried the faint, bracing scent of the autumn wind and the absolute, undeniable taste of total freedom. The oppressive, suffocating toxicity of that house, the heavy burden of childhood trauma, and constant manipulation vanished the exact second I crossed the threshold. Harrison stepped out behind me, and the heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a resounding, heavy thud. The locking mechanism clicked loudly into place, instantly cutting off the frantic, hysterical sobbing from inside. The sudden silence of the night was incredibly magnificent. At the bottom of the sweeping circular driveway, bathed in the soft golden glow of the estate's exterior lighting, sat a sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My personal driver, a quiet, fiercely loyal, and highly trained professional named David, stood at absolute attention beside the rear passenger door. As I approached the luxury vehicle, he offered a deep, respectful nod and pulled the heavy armored door open for me. I slid into the expansive, temperature-controlled cabin, sinking deeply into the plush, hand-stitched leather interior. Harrison climbed into the front passenger seat, giving David a single nod to depart. The massive, powerful engine purred to life, a low, vibrating hum that signaled relentless forward momentum. The tires crunched softly against the gravel as we pulled away from the property I now legally owned, leaving the ruined, foreclosed mansion fading into the rearview mirror. As the luxury vehicle glided smoothly down the dark, tree-lined streets of the exclusive neighborhood, I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and retrieved my smartphone. The screen was already glowing brilliantly, with an incoming endless barrage of frantic notifications. Sydney was texting in rapid, desperate bursts, begging for a private conversation, promising she could change, pleading for a microscopic fraction of the trust fund she had just tried to steal. Patricia was leaving scattered, hysterical, weeping voicemails, claiming she had always loved me. Richard was sending erratic, panicked emails about renegotiating corporate terms. I did not read a single message. I did not listen to a single second of their audio. With cold, surgical, and absolute precision, I opened my contact list. I selected Richard's profile and hit block. I selected Patricia's profile and hit block. Finally, I selected Sydney's profile and hit block. The digital tether was completely, irreversibly severed. They were permanently eradicated from my personal network, just as efficiently and legally as they had been eradicated from my property deed. They no longer existed in my universe. Next to me, built directly into the custom-polished wood center console of the Rolls-Royce, sat a chilled bottle of vintage champagne resting in a silver ice bucket. It was the exact same prestigious label my father had desperately tried to serve his elite guests. But this specific bottle was paid for with legitimate, undeniable, and hard-earned capital. I reached out my hands perfectly steady and poured a generous measure of the golden liquid into a crystal flute. The delicate bubbles rose rapidly to the surface, bright, sharp, and completely untethered. I leaned back into the soft leather seat, watching the dark silhouettes of the city skyline begin to emerge through the tinted windows. I raised the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. It tasted like absolute, unadulterated victory. The terrified, vulnerable girl they had thrown into a freezing rainstorm 10 years ago was officially dead and buried. In her place sat a powerful, independent woman who owned her own empire, dictated her own ruthless terms, and commanded her own brilliant destiny. The war was entirely over, the enemies were vanquished, and I had won absolutely everything.